The most dangerous people are usually the ones nobody notices. On a cold Friday night in Norfolk, Virginia, the Harbor Light Bar was packed shoulder to shoulder with sailors, contractors, tourists, and off-duty military personnel looking for a few quiet hours before another demanding week began. Country music drifted through the air. Television screens glowed above the counter. Glasses clinked. Laughter rolled from table to table. In the middle of all that noise sat a woman almost nobody paid attention to. Claire Whitmore occupied the last stool at the far end of the bar, away from the crowd. She wore a simple gray jacket, faded blue jeans, and a pair of worn boots that looked like they had traveled far more miles than most people ever would. A glass of iced tea rested untouched in front of her. She wasn't scrolling through her phone. She wasn't watching television. She wasn't trying to start a conversation. She simply sat there, quietly observing the room. The bartender had noticed her arrive nearly an hour earlier. She had spoken only 4 words. "Tea. No lemon, please." Since then, she had barely moved. Most people would have forgotten she was there. But not everyone. The front door opened, and a group of Navy SEALs stepped inside, instantly drawing attention from several patrons. Their posture, confidence, and easy camaraderie made them hard to miss. They weren't in uniform, but they carried themselves with the unmistakable presence of men accustomed to discipline and responsibility. At the center of the group was Ethan Hayes. Tall, athletic, and respected within his community, Ethan had the relaxed confidence of someone used to being listened to. The group claimed a section near the bar, exchanging stories and jokes while waiting for their drinks. For several minutes, everything felt ordinary. Then one of the younger operators noticed Claire sitting alone. "She's been staring over here all night," he joked quietly. Another laughed. "Maybe she's trying to figure out who's buying the next round." Ethan glanced toward the far end of the counter. Claire wasn't actually staring at them. She seemed more interested in the reflections dancing across the bottles behind the bar. Still, something about her caught his attention. Maybe it was her composure. Maybe it was the way she seemed completely comfortable being ignored. Most people wanted attention. She appeared to want the opposite. A few minutes later, Ethan noticed something else. When one of the televisions briefly displayed footage from a naval ceremony, Claire's eyes shifted toward the screen. Only for a second, but the expression on her face changed. Not excitement, not curiosity, recognition. The kind of recognition that comes from memory. Then it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Ethan leaned back slightly. For reasons he couldn't explain, he suddenly found himself wondering a question that had never crossed his mind before. Who exactly was the quiet woman at the end of the bar, and why did it feel like she knew something everyone else had forgotten? The question lingered in Ethan Hayes' mind long after he first noticed her. Most people revealed something about themselves within minutes. A favorite sports team, a profession, a hometown. Claire Whitmore revealed nothing. She remained seated at the far end of the counter, her posture relaxed, her attention drifting between the room and the quiet thoughts she never seemed interested in sharing. One of the younger operators eventually nudged Ethan. "You are staring." Ethan smirked. "I am observing." "Right," another replied. "That is what people call it when they are curious." The table laughed. Ethan shook his head and took a sip of water. "Something is different about her." "Different how?" "I do not know yet." The answer sounded ridiculous even to him. Across the room, Claire reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded receipt. She studied it briefly before slipping it back inside. The movement exposed a thin silver chain resting beneath her collar. Nothing unusual. Yet Ethan noticed that the chain was worn smooth with age, as though it had been carried every day for years. Most people replaced jewelry. Most people moved on. Claire looked like someone who carried old memories on purpose. A few minutes later, the bartender approached her. "Another tea?" Claire smiled politely. "No, thank you." "You waiting for somebody?" "No, just enjoying the evening." "Something like that." The bartender nodded and moved on. The exchange lasted less than 10 seconds. Still, Ethan noticed something strange. Claire never fidgeted, never checked the door, never reached for a phone. She seemed completely comfortable sitting alone in a crowded room. That kind of patience was rare. Then the television above the bar changed channels again. This time it showed footage from a naval retirement ceremony. Uniforms, flags, salutes. The camera briefly captured a formation standing at attention. Claire's eyes lifted toward the screen. For a split second, her expression hardened. Not with pride, not with nostalgia, with recognition. Then it disappeared. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Did you see that? One of the operators followed his gaze. See what? Her reaction. To a retirement ceremony? Exactly. The operator laughed. Maybe she has family in the service. Ethan did not answer. Something felt off. Not suspicious. Familiar. As if he had seen that expression before. Hours spent in briefing rooms had taught him to recognize small details. The calm face. The constant awareness. The habit of watching exits without appearing to watch them. Claire was not acting nervous. She was acting prepared. The realization settled quietly into the back of his mind. Then one of the younger operators stood and grinned. There is only one way to solve this mystery. Ethan already knew where this was going. Do not. I am doing it. Before anyone could stop him, the young operator walked toward the far end of the counter. Claire looked up as he approached. The room remained loud and busy, but Ethan suddenly found himself paying attention to every word that would come next. The young operator stopped beside Claire's stool with the easy confidence of someone who had never been given a reason to doubt himself. He smiled politely at first. Ma'am, my friends and I have a bet. Claire looked up from her glass. That sounds dangerous. A few people nearby laughed. The operator grinned. Nothing serious. We were just trying to figure out what your story is. Claire's expression remained calm. I'm not sure I have a very interesting one. See, that is exactly what someone with a very interesting story would say. More laughter followed from the seal table. Claire gave a small smile, but said nothing. The operator leaned lightly against the counter. Military family? No. Civilian contractor? No. Former law enforcement? No. Every answer came in the same quiet tone. Ethan watched from across the room. Most people would have become annoyed by now. Claire seemed completely unbothered. The young operator finally raised both hands in surrender. All right, I am out of guesses. That happens sometimes, Claire replied. Not often to him. Someone called from the table. The room chuckled again. The operator pointed toward the group behind him. Those guys think they can read people. They are usually pretty good at it. Claire glanced briefly toward Ethan and the others. Usually? The operator laughed. Fair point. For a moment, it seemed the conversation was ending. Then his eyes drifted toward the silver chain beneath Claire's collar. Only a small section was visible, but it looked older than the rest of her clothing. Not decorative. Not fashionable. Carried. That necklace means something? He asked. Claire's fingers instinctively touched the chain before dropping away. Everything means something to somebody. The answer caught Ethan's attention immediately. It sounded less like a response and more like a rule she had lived by. The operator noticed it too. You talk like somebody who has seen a lot. Claire looked toward the television again. The naval ceremony had ended, replaced by a weather report showing storms moving along the Atlantic coast. Most people have, she said quietly. They just do not talk about it. The operator studied her for a second. Then he smiled. Now I am definitely curious. Back at the table, Ethan felt something strange settle into place. It was not anything Claire said. It was the way she said it. Every answer was measured. Every movement deliberate. No wasted words. No need to impress anyone. The same discipline he had seen in briefing rooms, training facilities, and operators with decades of experience. A waitress passed by carrying a tray. As she stepped around a chair, one glass began sliding toward the edge. Before anyone else noticed, Claire's hand moved. She steadied the glass and released it without interrupting the conversation. The waitress blinked. Thank you. Claire simply nodded. Ethan narrowed his eyes. She had reacted before the glass was even visibly falling. Tiny detail. Tiny reaction. Yet operators were trained to notice tiny details. The young SEAL followed Claire's gaze toward the door and smiled. One last question. Claire raised an eyebrow. Only one. Only one. Then I promise I will leave you alone. For the first time all evening, Ethan found himself genuinely interested in the answer. Something told him that whatever came next was about to change the entire atmosphere inside the Harbor Light Bar. The young operator smiled and folded his arms. All right. Last question. No more guessing games. Claire nodded slightly. Go ahead. He looked back toward his teammates, earning a few encouraging gestures from the table. If somebody spent enough time around military people, they usually pick up little habits. The way they sit, the way they watch a room, the way they answer questions. Claire remained silent. And you have every one of those habits. A few nearby patrons began listening now, not because anything dramatic was happening, but because curiosity had quietly spread through the room. So what is the question? Claire asked. The operator smiled. Were you ever military? For the first time all evening, Claire did not answer immediately. The pause was brief. Maybe 2 seconds. Yet Ethan noticed it. So did everyone else paying attention. Claire looked down at the untouched glass in front of her before lifting her eyes again. A long time ago. The operator grinned triumphantly and pointed toward his table. I knew it. Laughter followed. Ethan smiled as well, but his curiosity only grew stronger. The answer explained very little. Thousands of people had served. Thousands carried old habits long after leaving the military. Yet something still felt unusual. Army? The operator asked. Claire shook her head. Navy? Another small shake. Marine Corps? No, Air Force. No, the operator laughed. You are making this difficult. Claire gave a faint smile. You said one question. Several people chuckled. Even Ethan found himself laughing. The woman had a dry sense of humor hidden beneath all that quiet composure. The operator started to return to his table, then paused. Actually, now I have about 20 more questions. That sounds like a personal problem. More laughter erupted around the bar. The atmosphere felt lighter now. Relaxed. Friendly. Yet Ethan could not shake the feeling that they were all standing near the edge of something they did not understand. As the operator stepped away, Claire adjusted the sleeve of her jacket. The movement was small, ordinary, but Ethan caught sight of something near her wrist. A faded scar running diagonally across the skin. Not fresh, not dramatic. Old. The kind of mark left by a life that had involved difficult places and difficult days. Claire immediately pulled the sleeve back into place. Most people never would have noticed. Ethan did. His training had conditioned him to notice details others missed. A few moments later, one of the bartenders accidentally dropped a metal tray behind the counter. The loud crash caused several customers to jump. Claire did not. Not even a flinch. Her eyes shifted toward the sound instantly, assessed it, and relaxed before anyone else had fully reacted. Ethan watched carefully. There it was again. Awareness. Controlled. Automatic. Familiar. Across the room, one of the operators called out jokingly, Hey Ethan, you still trying to figure her out? Several heads turned toward him. Ethan raised his glass. Maybe. Claire looked directly at him for the first time that evening. Not defensive. Not uncomfortable. Just curious. For a brief moment neither spoke. Then Ethan stood from his chair. You know what, he said calmly. I think I should ask my own question. And for reasons he could not explain, the entire room suddenly felt quieter. Claire watched Ethan approach without the slightest sign of concern. Around them, conversations softened as people sensed something interesting unfolding. Not dramatic. Not confrontational. Just unusual. Ethan stopped beside the empty stool next to her and rested one hand on the counter. Mind if I sit? Claire glanced at the stool. It is a free country. A few nearby patrons smiled. Ethan sat down. Up close, he noticed details he had missed from across the room. The faint lines at the corners of her eyes. The posture that remained perfectly balanced even while relaxed. The calm expression of someone who had learned long ago that there was no benefit in proving anything to strangers. My friends think I am overthinking this, Ethan said. Are you? Claire asked. Probably. That is usually a good sign. Ethan laughed quietly. How does that work? People who never question anything usually miss important details. The answer landed harder than she probably intended. Ethan found himself nodding. That was exactly what instructors had taught during years of training. Pay attention. Question assumptions. Notice what others ignore. He studied her for a moment. You know, most people get uncomfortable when a group of strangers starts asking questions. Claire looked toward the rows of bottles behind the bar. Most people are worried about being judged. And you are not. No, why? Claire's eyes reflected the soft amber lights above the counter. Because strangers rarely know enough to matter. Ethan leaned back slightly. There it was again. Another answer that sounded simple until you thought about it. Across the room, the younger operators were pretending not to watch. They were failing miserably. Claire noticed them immediately. Your team is very subtle. Ethan smiled. Not their strongest skill. Clearly, for the first time that evening, Ethan saw the hint of genuine amusement in her expression. It changed her entire appearance. Not younger, lighter, human. Then his attention drifted to the silver chain beneath her collar again. Something about it continued bothering him. Not because it looked expensive. Quite the opposite. It looked old, important, personal. Can I ask you something? Ethan said. You already are. He shook his head with a laugh. Fair enough. What is the story behind the chain? For the first time all evening, Claire's smile faded. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. Her fingers briefly touched the metal hidden beneath her jacket. A small gesture, almost unconscious. Ethan immediately regretted asking. You do not have to answer. Claire remained silent for several seconds. The noise of the bar seemed distant now. Finally she spoke. It belonged to someone who never came home. Ethan felt the atmosphere shift instantly. Not sadness exactly. Wait, the kind that comes from memories carried for years. Before he could respond, one of the televisions changed channels again. A military documentary flashed across the screen. A helicopter appeared against a desert horizon. Claire's eyes moved toward it automatically. Ethan followed her gaze. Then he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. For the first time all night, Claire was not watching the aircraft. She was studying the unit insignia painted near the door, and she recognized it immediately. The image on the television lasted only a few seconds before the documentary moved on, but Ethan could already tell that Claire had recognized something most people would never have noticed. The insignia had been small, partially obscured by dust and sunlight, yet her eyes had found it immediately. Not the aircraft, not the crew, the insignia. Ethan looked back at the screen. You know that unit? Claire remained quiet for a moment. I knew people who wore that patch. The answer was simple, but it carried the same weight as the chain around her neck. Ethan studied her profile. Friends. Claire kept watching the screen even though the image was gone. Something like that. The room around them gradually returned to normal conversation, but Ethan's attention never left her. Every answer seemed to reveal something while hiding something larger. Across the bar, one of the younger operators called out, Ethan, are you interrogating people now? A few laughs followed. Ethan shook his head. Just talking. Looks serious from over here. Claire glanced toward the group. They worry about you. That obvious? Very. Ethan smiled. You noticed that? People tell you who they are when they think nobody is watching. The sentence landed with surprising force. Ethan thought about it for a second and realized she was right. The operators joking across the room. The bartender checking on regular customers. The waitress remembering orders without writing them down. Everyone revealed pieces of themselves through small actions. Claire seemed unusually skilled at seeing those details. What about me? Ethan asked. What am I telling people? Claire looked at him directly. Not judgmental. Not confrontational. Simply observant. You carry responsibility well. Ethan blinked. That is specific. It is accurate. Anything else? Claire glanced toward his teammates. You look at them before making decisions. Ethan followed her gaze. She was right. He had done it several times without realizing it. Most leaders do that. Not all of them. Another answer. Another clue. Ethan found himself increasingly convinced that the woman beside him had spent years in environments where leadership mattered. Then the bartender approached carrying a fresh tray of glasses. Compliments of the gentleman at table 6, he said. Claire looked across the room. An older veteran lifted his glass respectfully. She returned a small nod. You know him? Ethan asked. No, then why would he buy your drink? Claire smiled faintly. Because he thinks I remind him of someone. Ethan looked toward the veteran. The man had not taken his eyes off Claire since she arrived. Not with recognition exactly. More like curiosity. The kind that appears when an old memory is trying to return. Claire noticed it too. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Calm. Thoughtful. Familiar. Then the veteran slowly stood from his table. He hesitated for a second before beginning to walk toward them. Ethan felt the atmosphere shift again. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just different. And for the first time that evening, Claire looked as though she already knew exactly who was coming and why. The veteran moved slowly through the crowded bar, carrying himself with the careful balance of someone whose body remembered years that his face preferred to forget. Conversations faded around him as he approached. Not because anyone recognized him, but because something in his expression suggested purpose. Claire watched him come without surprise. Ethan noticed that immediately. She was not trying to identify the man. She already had. The veteran stopped a few feet away and studied her for several long seconds. His eyes moved from her face to the silver chain beneath her collar and then back again. I knew it, he said quietly. Claire offered a polite nod. Good evening, sir. Ethan looked between them. You two know each other? The veteran let out a short laugh. That depends on how you define knowing somebody. Claire remained silent. The veteran shook his head in disbelief. 20 years. Ethan frowned. What? The man looked at Claire. 20 years, and you still sit facing the exit. A faint smile appeared on Claire's face. Old habits. That is what they always say. The veteran pulled out the empty stool beside them and sat down. Several of the younger operators were openly watching now. Even the bartender had slowed down enough to listen. You remember me? The veteran asked. Claire answered immediately. Staff Sergeant Robert Callahan. United States Navy. Retired. You hated powdered eggs and carried a deck of cards in your cargo pocket. Ethan's eyebrows lifted. The veteran stared at her and laughed. I cannot believe you remember that. You lost that deck 3 separate times. And somehow got it back every time. Because people kept returning it. The veteran shook his head. Unbelievable. Ethan felt a strange sensation growing in the pit of his stomach. The conversation sounded casual, but something underneath it felt important. Where did you serve together? Ethan asked. Robert glanced toward Claire before answering. Different places. That is not really an answer. No, Robert admitted. It is not. He leaned back and studied Claire again. You know, most people spend their lives trying to be remembered. Claire looked down at her glass. Most people should not. The veteran's smile faded. Still carrying that philosophy. It worked before. Did it? The question hung in the air. For the first time all evening, Ethan saw something shift in Claire's expression. Not discomfort. Memory. The kind that appears when a door opens onto a room someone has spent years trying not to revisit. Robert noticed it too and changed the subject immediately. Your chain. His voice softened. You still wear it. Claire's hand moved instinctively toward the silver chain beneath her collar. Every day. Robert nodded slowly. He would have appreciated that. Silence settled over the bar. Not awkward silence. Respectful silence. Ethan did not know who they were talking about, but he suddenly understood one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever history connected these two people was far larger than either of them intended to reveal. Then Robert looked directly at Ethan and asked a question that made Claire finally look away from the table. Has she told you her call sign yet? The question seemed to pull the air out of the room. Even the operators at the far table stopped pretending not to listen. Ethan looked from Robert Callahan to Claire. Call sign, he repeated. Robert nodded slowly. Everybody had one. Some were forgettable. Some stayed with you. Claire lowered her eyes toward the glass in front of her. Robert. The veteran smiled faintly. What? You think I am going to tell them? You usually do. A few people laughed softly. Robert leaned back in his chair. Not this time. Ethan noticed something he had not seen before. For the first time all evening, Claire seemed slightly uncomfortable. Not afraid. Not nervous. Just reluctant. As though an old door was being pushed open. I have a feeling this is not a normal call sign, Ethan said. Robert let out a short laugh. Normal? No. Nothing about it was normal. Claire shook her head. You always exaggerate. Actually, Robert replied. I usually do the opposite. The statement hung in the air. Ethan watched the exchange carefully. These were not people remembering a routine assignment. This felt deeper than that. Years deeper. The bartender quietly moved closer while wiping down the counter. Several patrons nearby had completely abandoned their own conversations. Nobody wanted to interrupt. Robert looked toward the silver chain beneath Claire's collar. You know what I remember most? Claire sighed softly. Please do not. Too late. Robert smiled. Everybody else was trying to be noticed. She spent her entire career trying not to be. Ethan raised an eyebrow. That sounds impossible. Exactly. Robert pointed toward Claire. She used to disappear in plain sight. Walk through a room and nobody would remember she was there. Then 6 months later somebody would realize she had solved 3 problems nobody else even noticed. Claire stared at her drink. I was doing my job. You were doing everybody's job. More laughter followed, but Ethan could tell Robert was serious beneath the humor. Then the veteran's expression softened. The funny thing is, people always remembered the call sign, never the person. Claire remained silent. Why? Ethan asked. Robert looked at him carefully. Because the call sign became a story, and stories grow larger than the people inside them. The room grew quiet again. Ethan felt his curiosity turning into something else now. Respect. Not because he knew who Claire was. Because he was beginning to understand how many people seemed to carry memories connected to her. Robert glanced toward Claire one last time. You want to tell him? Claire looked out the front window at the dark Virginia street beyond the glass. For several seconds nobody spoke. Finally, she took a slow breath and turned back toward Ethan. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "If I tell you," she said, "you are going to spend the rest of the night asking questions I cannot answer." Ethan smiled. "That sounds like a risk I am willing to take." And for the first time all evening, Claire actually laughed. Claire's laughter faded, but the warmth remained in her eyes for a moment longer. It was enough to make everyone in the room realize how rarely she allowed herself to relax. Ethan smiled back. "See? That was not so difficult." Claire shook her head. "You have no idea." Robert Callahan chuckled quietly beside them. "That is probably the most accurate thing anybody has said all night." The bartender finally gave up pretending to work and leaned against the counter. "Well, now I need to know." A few customers nodded in agreement. Someone near the back raised a hand. "Same." Claire looked around the room and sighed with the kind of patience usually reserved for stubborn family members. "This is exactly why I never answer questions." Robert laughed. "Because people become curious? Because they never stop." More laughter spread through the bar. Yet beneath the humor, Ethan sensed something changing. Nobody was looking at Claire the same way anymore. Earlier, she had been the quiet woman sitting alone at the end of the counter. Now she had become the center of the room without ever trying to be. That alone told him something important. People were responding to her presence, not her words. Robert rested his forearms on the counter. "You know what the funny part is?" he asked. "Nobody ever believed the stories." Ethan glanced toward him. "Stories?" Robert nodded. "The stories connected to that call sign." Claire immediately looked away. "Robert, I know. I know." He raised both hands. "No details." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "There were stories?" "Thousands of them." The veteran smiled. "Most were probably exaggerated." "Probably?" Ethan asked. Robert laughed. "Maybe not." The room listened in complete silence. Claire stared out the front window again where a light rain had started falling across the empty street. "People always make legends out of ordinary things," she said quietly. Robert shook his head. "Not this time." The words hung in the air. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Ethan looked directly at Claire. "So what was it?" Claire turned back toward him. "What was what?" "The call sign." Robert smiled knowingly. The bartender stopped moving. Even the operators at the far table leaned forward. Claire looked at each face in the room. Curious, expectant, patient. Then her fingers lightly touched the silver chain beneath her collar. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm enough to be mistaken for ordinary conversation. "Viper 1. The effect was immediate." Robert lowered his eyes. The bartender blinked. Several veterans near the back exchanged startled looks. Ethan felt the name strike a memory buried deep inside years of briefings and old conversations. Not a person, a reputation, a name that appeared in stories nobody could fully verify. His expression changed before he could stop it. Claire noticed. Of course she noticed. "You have heard it before," she said. Ethan swallowed slowly. "Yes." Claire nodded once. "Then you know why I do not talk about it." Ethan stared at her in silence. Because suddenly he understood that the quiet woman sitting beside him had spent years carrying a history far larger than anyone in that room had imagined. And for the first time all night, he realized that the stories might not have been stories at all.